Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. This week, let's talk about violence and virtue. Last week, I mentioned that some people outsource a lot of their needs, including their need for violence in the form of calling the police. But it's also the case that a lot of people don't have the kind of violence in their lives that even requires them to involve themselves with the police. I think of my own background. I grew up in a very nonviolent home in a fairly peaceful community. I got in one fist fight when I was in 7th grade. Didn't like it so much, so didn't do that more in the future. Most of my friends went to college rather than joining the military after high school. And I even get my meat to eat in the sanitary, hands clean way of buying it at the supermarket rather than going out and hunting it myself. So it's easy for people who come from backgrounds like mine to only see the negative side of violence. And we oftentimes think of guns as bad because we think of violence as only being bad. I found a good example of this in a book that I picked up over the weekend at the suggestion of the literary agent I've been talking to about my own book. And as I usually do when I read a book, I look at the acknowledgments first to get a sense of where the author's coming from. So this is a book about the violent making of the Industrial Revolution, the role of guns and the gun industry in creating the world that we live in. And in the acknowledgments, the author, who's a history professor at Stanford University, writes, "Like everything I write, this book is for my children. In 2010, when Aman was 4, she asked a policeman sitting at our local taqueria why he had a gun. The policeman explained he had it to protect everyone from bad guys. And Aman bravely replied, 'But if you have a gun, then you are a bad guy.'" Now, I don't know this author. I don't know what she would actually do if her 4-year-old was attacked and needed to be defended immediately. But I know that my own conversion to gun ownership was driven in large part by a felt need to protect my children. I had a life-altering realization that if I needed to immediately protect my children or myself, that I would not be able to outsource that violence to somebody else, that I would need to handle it immediately by myself and for myself. As firefighters know, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. So in that sense, violence can be a positive force by which we counter negative violence. Violence, in that sense, can be virtuous. Many people not only think of all violence as being bad, but academics who study violence oftentimes only focus on quote-unquote bad violence, as Fisk and Rye observe in their book Virtuous Violence. They write, "Yet most theories of violence exclude or simply ignore defense and punishment, providing no explanation for them or not integrating the account of them into the overall theory of violence, which is a priori defined to exclude them." And they continue, "However, most people recognize some rights in their persons and property, rights that entitle a person to protect what is theirs. Hence, threats or harm to herself, her family, or her property are transgressions against the victim, and defensive violence is virtuous. Thus, when humans violently defend their children, spouses, family, buddies, or allies, this defense is virtuous violence. It is virtuous because protecting partners is the core of the relationship. It is a moral obligation to protect one's partners, and throughout history, humans have accorded great honor to heroes who aggressively defend themselves, their families, or their communities." In other words, as this t-shirt puts it, violence can be virtuous. I found that shirt after I observed a knife fighting class taught by Craig Douglas, and in that class was a very slight but very tenacious woman who on the second day of the class wore a shirt that said, "Give violence a chance." After the class, I wanted to learn more about her, and I saw that she ran a company called Healthy Buffalo, and she sold this shirt that said, "Violence can be virtuous." And not only that, but she actually gave credit for the idea of the t-shirt to an essay I wrote on guns and virtue, which I'll link to in the show notes. Now, we don't want to romanticize violence, and we recognize that many forms of the virtuous violence that Fisk and Rye talk about in their book are things that we would find morally objectionable, like rape and intimate partner violence. But any comprehensive understanding of violence has to be able to appreciate that violence can be virtuous, which is not to say that it is always virtuous. Tell me what you think about this idea in the comments.